have a conversation with former Secretary of Agriculture Ann Veneman. I'm just delighted, Ann, that you could join us today. I know she's no stranger to many of you, especially here from California, but she served as Secretary of Agriculture from 2001 to 2005, and prior to that, she had a very distinguished career with several other positions: a lawyer, deputy secretary, secretary of the California Department of Agriculture, and those are just a few of the many roles that she's played over a very distinguished career. And after leaving USDA, she went on to serve on the boards of several different, on to serve as the head of UNICEF, executive director there, and then to serve on numerous boards, including the Nestle board, which she just recently stepped down from, and also serves on as a board member for Sunworld, an advisor for Perfect Day, Upside Foods, Full Harvest, and more. So I'm just delighted she even had time to find in her schedule that she could join us today. So I wanted to start, I've got several questions, and we're just going to have a conversation about some of the things that she experienced during her illustrious career. So we all have been talking today about evolution and adaptability, and we also know that even during the time that you were serving as secretary, agriculture evolved a great deal. And one of the things that you helped define that evolution was with some of the release of a blueprint, which you managed to find still. It's still out there in circulation. In fact, one of our participants mentioned it to me today because it was such a forward-looking document. The formal title was Food and Agricultural Policy, Taking Stock for the New Century. And I'd just like to start with having you explore a little bit about what did you see as some of the biggest trends at that time when you were serving as secretary and producing that document.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that introduction. And is this on? And yeah, I hadn't really thought about this document for a long time until a couple weeks ago. I was at a party at the Silicon Valley, and some guy knew he was going to meet me, so he found it online and read the whole thing, and he said, "It's all still very relevant today." And then, like 3 days later, Sarah and I were talking on the phone, and she said, in preparation for this, and she said, "I'd like to ask you about that document." And so within the course of 1 week, suddenly my brain had to be triggered, and I had to find it in my garage in a box way high up. But I found it. And I think one of the things is to really look at why did we do this? We were starting a new century. It was 2001. We were going to have a farm bill. And I talked a lot, during my time as Secretary of California Department of Food and Ag about the changes that were going on in the food and agriculture sector. And so in talking with some of the undersecretaries, we decided that it would be a good time to, rather than just start talking about the Farm Bill, to really talk about the future of food and agriculture. And so we talked about the trends of globalization. We talked about the environment, what was going on with the environment in terms of the need for farmers and ranchers have always talked about we're the best environmentalists. But some of the programs that we had, we talked about rural development and the fact that rural communities were now more economically diverse and seemed to be going in that direction. Not just focused on agriculture. We, of course, talked about the importance of infrastructure that we had in USDA, particularly around our food safety and pest and disease. And I will tell you, having walked in the Department of Agriculture, as I did in 2001, and being confronted by my first crisis of many with foot and mouth disease in Europe, and the real worry that we were going to get it here. And then, of course, we had exotic Newcastle disease out here for the first time in 50 years. We had bird flu in the U.S., and then, of course, we had the cow who stole Christmas. So that whole infrastructure part of the report, even during the time we were there, became very important. And, of course, the role of FSIS and food safety. That was part of the report. And then, of course, we covered our nutrition programs, recognizing that diet and health were more related, and we were having more problems with diet-related diseases in this country. And so, I mean, I looked back on this report, and really, a lot's changed, but a lot's stayed the same. And so I feel like we really, kind of hit the nail on the head on a lot of these issues and helped to start to frame, what is the future of agriculture?
Well, it's something that I think a lot of people should go back and perhaps reread. And that, to your point, you could find it online, right? If you go search, as that gentleman did. But as you look at that, were there some of the innovations that you're seeing today that were perhaps unforeseen at that time? And if so, what are some of those, new innovations or changes that you've seen in food systems?
Well, as I said, we certainly recognize the globalization of food, and we talked about the importance of trade. We were, later that year, we launched the Doha round, which has never come to an end. But, our trade was continuing to increase as our farmers really began to rely more and more on export markets. But things we didn't anticipate, as we've seen with the pandemic that we've all lived through, we saw disruptions in supply chains, shipping problems, some of the things we've been talking about today, which we really weren't talking about then in terms of some of the things that have come about as globalization has, really is part of our whole food system globally now. I think we also didn't anticipate something like a war with Russia and Ukraine, where they produce, I think, 10 to 12% of the grain output, and much of it's exported. We now see the impacts in some of the countries in Eastern Africa who are very dependent on those exports of grain from the Ukraine, who can't get access to food now. So the globalization, I think, we now are seeing in a different lens, and I think we're trying to adjust and adapt, as we've been talking about today. I think that as you look at some of the issues around, also with regard to the pandemic, we also saw issues within our own food system here, I think particularly in the meatpacking industry, where we saw a lot of disease within the plants. The question of, were the workers well enough protected? Some plants had to shut down, which then disrupted the supply of meat that was available to the consumers. So I think, again, we've seen just kind of overall disruption that we had never kind of encountered and before, that we did not know at that time. On technology, I noted that we talked particularly about biotechnology. And that was certainly a technology that was very in the forefront at that time. But I think when you look back 20 years now and you see the technologies that we've been talking about today with, many ag tech kind of innovation with knowledge on the farm, what's happening, giving farmers more tools to really be more proactive in how they manage their crops. In the food tech area, all kinds of innovation, whether it's, plant-based meats, new ways to make them, cultivated meats, dairy from fungi, fermented fungi. The list goes on and on. There's just so many innovations in agriculture, and I think the technology is just advancing the whole food system. And technology is really, it's addressing a lot of the labor shortage issues with the kinds of new opportunities we have to, have varieties that are able to be picked by machines rather than humans. So I think the technology has taken us even further and in directions we didn't know at that time. Then, of course, we talked about the environment, but we didn't really I think, understand the full aspect of climate change. And climate change, of course, now really affects agriculture. Agriculture can be a huge part of the solution, as we know, and we just heard from the woman who just talked to us, very interesting discussion from NASA, the opportunity to really use adaptive technologies to address the climate change which we're all feeling. So I think that in the area of the environment, we've really seen a lot of change, and a lot of the food community, including agriculture, coming together to try to come up with solutions for the future. The other issue that I haven't heard mentioned today is food waste. We weren't talking in the environment about food waste, but we talk about the fact that we need to produce now, the projections from the UN are that we need to produce, like 60% more food by 2050, but we also, in the world, waste between 30 and 40% of food. And so I think there are a number of innovative companies that are now trying to address food waste. I'm on the board of one and an advisor to another, and I think this is an issue, too, when we talk about the environment that's important. In looking at rural communities, when we addressed that in the report, we talked about, sort of the change of rural communities. But one of the things we now see is that poverty rates in rural America are now worse than in urban America. So we're seeing, more and more poverty. And unfortunately, the drug crisis that we've seen in this country over the past several years has hit rural America even harder. We talked, when I was at USDA, we really worked on trying to get rural broadband as being so important to American agriculture and the rural communities, and that still hasn't really happened. It's supposed to happen now under the infrastructure bill that was passed by Congress earlier. But, we cannot take our focus off the rural communities of this country either. They're just too important. And then finally, on nutrition, we've seen the overweight and obesity rates go up even more than where we were 20 years ago. And I think we've got to pay attention to this. I think we now have 40% of American adults are overweight. And and there are about almost 75 to 80% are overweight or obese in this country. So if we don't begin to address nutrition, I've been an advocate that we really need to begin to look at our nutrition programs. And so we've seen a lot of change there. So again, I look at that report and I don't see anything that we projected wrongly. It's just that there's a lot that's happened since that we didn't anticipate.
Well, you touched on so many points that I'd like to dig into, but just even the one on biotechnology, which was advancing perhaps more slowly than it is now, but still, as you look at the opportunities from biotech right now, we've got the ability to breed tomatoes with higher levels of antioxidants. We've got, the ability to really look at nutraceuticals. Food is medicine. There are so many opportunities out there, but oftentimes the regulatory structure does not support those innovations. So as someone who was kind of at the forefront of these changes coming forward, what kind of advice would you have for government leaders and regulators about how we open up and improve the pipeline for these types of new products to come on that can really help not only production ag, but individual health?
Well, I think this is a very important question. Part of it is the regulators can't regulate what they don't understand. And so I think that it's very important for, emerging industries to help to educate the regulators. And there's a variety of ways to do that. But one thing, I've seen I've seen some of these food startups, they just go on and put their product on the market without even ever thinking about the regulatory framework. And so then they get in trouble, and the regulators come after them. So it's important to really try to figure out, how do you anticipate the regulatory environment? I want to give you one example of this. I'm an advisor to what was Memphis Meats, is now Upside Foods. It's a cell-based cultured meat company. And one of the reasons I agreed to be an advisor to them was because one of their first hires was a scientist who had 7 years' experience in FDA. And they have really worked to figure out, with the rest of the industry, the regulatory framework, which is very complicated for cultivated meat. Because it's made out of the meat of cells, it comes under the jurisdiction of the USDA, because USDA has jurisdiction over meat and poultry inspection, whereas FDA over other foods. Some people wanted it and argued that we're also in the same space. They argued for it only to be regulated in FDA. Well, that was never going to be, something that was very workable with the way the law is written. So it's been a long process, but I think there is almost a complete framework there to allow cultivated meat to come to the market. But the other part of that has not only been to educate the regulators, but also to really spend time with the meat industry itself so they understand what this technology is, that it's not to replace, but give consumers another alternative. And so I think as we go forward with a lot of these new issues, it's going to be very important to have industry and government conversations where everybody can really understand the kind of background. You talked about food as medicine. That's also something that the healthcare industry is experimenting with. They're doing pilot programs with. Part of the problem is there's not enough reimbursement through insurance companies and Medicaid and Medicare for it now, but it is a very promising area. I think not so much from a regulatory perspective, but much more from how do you reimburse, how do you set up the structure to reimburse for this? And that's going to be something for the health agencies to really figure out.
Yeah, there's so much more innovation out there that we need to figure out. And as you see the research that's developing at universities all around the country, it's just kind of blows your mind about the possibilities that we really do have if we can get the regulatory pathway figured out. And it's also a good segue for our next panel after we're done. That's one of the things we're going to be talking about, is getting beyond those regulatory issues. Speaking of nutrition, you've done a lot of work with the Bipartisan Policy Center. Secretary Glickman and you have worked hand in hand on a lot of different issues, as well as other individuals. You referenced the fact that hunger is still very, very prevalent, not only in urban but rural areas. And I keep, you listen to Congressman McGovern, others who are convinced that we should be able to solve hunger in America. But some of the recent reports that came out are suggesting globally we're going to really struggle because of some of the setbacks we've had, and certainly the war in Ukraine has not made things any easier. We know there's a White House conference coming up this fall. They're going to try to answer this question. What do you think? You've referenced before that perhaps it's a little early for them to even be doing the conference, but what do you think is possible and doable from that, and what else would you like to see in addition to perhaps that conference? Well,
this is the first conference, White House conference on hunger and nutrition that's been held since the Nixon administration 53 years ago. I am on an advisory panel that was put together by Tufts University, their nutrition school, that is putting together a report to submit to the group, the White House conference, with some suggestions on what we can do with feeding programs and so forth. There was a listening session for this in Oakland was it only a week ago today? Yes.
Time
No,
flies when you're
no, that
having
was the
fun.
4th of July, a week ago today. It was 2 weeks ago today. And, bringing people together from all over the food industry, some people doing, feeding programs for the poor people. We had a representation from the Native American communities. Healthcare, Kaiser was the host of that. Talking about all of the different issues. Food is medicine. There was a whole panel on that, some of the scientists from UC Davis. So all of this is being considered. So there's hunger being addressed. There is feeding programs, the kind of new opportunities in medical nutrition, and then also this whole issue of nutrition generally and what to do with our food programs. Now, one of our most effective nutrition programs is WIC. Some of us have argued that the SNAP program, which changed its name from food stamps to the Supplemental, and I underscore the word nutrition assistance program a few years ago, is not a nutrition program at all, but rather it's just whatever you want to buy. So 10%, a little over 10%, of SNAP money is spent on soft drinks, which have no nutritional value whatsoever. And so some of us have argued that this food stamp program ought to look a lot more like the WIC program and truly be a nutrition program, because if the public is going to pay for these programs, we're paying for these diet-related diseases through our medical programs. And so it's really a burden on society. It's a burden on the healthcare system. I mean, we can't even get enough people in the military because they don't meet the requirements anymore because there's so much overweight and obesity that they don't meet the requirements. We have to rethink food and nutrition in this country to address this issue of food and healthcare now. So we've really looked at a lot of these issues through our Bipartisan Policy Center reports. These are issues that are coming up around the White House conference, and so I think and of course, California has a great place in this whole debate because we grow so many of the fresh fruits and vegetables here that a lot of people don't eat and would benefit from.
Absolutely. So switching gears a little bit, talk about climate change. It was discussed in our last session. We have a lot of companies right now who are making commitments, especially Scope 3 emission commitments, and they're going to need agriculture to help them comply with those. We recently wrote about the Securities and Exchange Commission, perhaps with their proposal requiring more transparency in how companies are going to do that. You've served on the board of one of the largest food companies in the world. So what do you see as how these companies are going to either mandate or partner, or however they're going to work with those who are going to be producing our food to meet these emission goals?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk a little bit about this from the perspective of Nestle, where I chaired the Sustainability Committee. But I think it's important to recognize that food companies generally are really stepping up to the plate, making commitments. Both Unilever and Nestle have committed to trying to enhance regenerative agriculture. They've committed to, the food companies are committing to reducing their overall emissions, including through agriculture. But the packaging issue is another very big issue. The packaging, the plastics, all of these kinds of things. We just had an almond example from Modesto, so I'm going to give you a dairy example from Modesto. So Nestle, one of their big, of course, they have a lot of milk products, and so they have a huge reliance on dairy around the world, and they've worked with farmers all around the world. There's a carnation plant, which is owned by Nestle in Modesto, and they have contract farmers, so they're working with those farmers to implement programs that will reduce the emissions from cows, from the dairy cows. they just sent me some stuff on this, and they entered into a $10 million multi-year partnership with the U.S. Dairy Net Zero Initiative. And I mean, that's a pretty significant partnership to really begin to look at how do you find the solutions, pilot them, and then make them more widely available for dairy producers around the world. They've also invested in a specific farm near Modesto, over $1 million, to really look at all of the practices on farm. They are also working with their contract dairy farmers in piloting the use of these feed additives that reduce the emissions from the specific cows. Another initiative they've had in, there's been a lot of work in conditional cash transfers through governments in development work, but they've also started using it. I think this is very innovative. From the private sector, they're using conditional cash transfers with their cocoa farmers to incentivize better growing practices, pruning practices, and reforestation. So part of what they're training them is to reforest and create more trees to suck carbon for the environment, which I thought was also a very innovative kind of partnership. So I think that as we move toward more environmentally friendly farming practices, some of this will come in partnership with the food processors themselves who are buying the product.
And that harkens back to the other point about regulatory pathway, because I was with DSM and Elanco not too long ago at an event, and there are incredible pathways in Europe. If you can believe, they're very far ahead of us on having these feed additives that can, reduce the emissions from dairy cows, and we haven't been able to move it forward in the U.S. So it just goes to that point about having these new projects that hopefully companies can pilot, but they can get the approval to use all the tools that they need to do so.
Absolutely.
Well, as we wrap up here, just one last question for you that's a little bit more personal in nature, because First Secretary of Agriculture at USDA is a female, and also
Still the
as
only.
deputy. Yes. And as deputy, now there is another female, and there have been other female deputies. First is here at CDFA. Have we made the progress that you think we should have made in diversifying the workforce now?
In the food and agriculture sector, yeah. I mean, looking around this room, it wouldn't have looked like this 20 or 25 years ago. At least there's a much better split of males and females. So I think women have done very well in agriculture. There's still a long way to go, I think, but we have a lot more women who are in higher positions in USDA and other organizations. Well, certainly CDFA, I think Karen Ross ended up with all her undersecretaries being women. That never would have happened when I was there. It just couldn't have happened. But so, you see real progress. As you say, there's been several deputy secretaries. I was the first one when I came in I think it was 1992 or 2, I guess. And but I do think there needs to be more focus, not just on women, but ethnic diversity in agriculture. We have a lot of new programs through the USDA looking at how do you have more ethnically diverse farmers. There's been a lot of there were a lot of lawsuits around all of this. Some of these legal issues that the USDA has gone through. I think we need to find real ways to help farmers, not just ethnically diverse farmers, but have more ethnically diverse members of the staff of USDA and the trade associations and the university researchers. We do need to work more on diversity. So again, I think it's the obligation of all of us that have been the first to open doors wide enough for others to get through. And hopefully we can all do that who have the opportunity to be in these kinds of positions.
Well, thank you, Ann. Please join me in thanking Secretary Veneman for her comment.